for her temporary employees, and she calls them into her office, and she starts with the last one first, and she gives them a check for $100. Gives the next one. She's just handing these $100 checks out to these people. Well, you know the one that's been in there filling out forms and licking envelopes and putting on stamps and addressing things all day long is going, $100. And Phil over here got $100. Wait a minute, that's not right. Now, we'd all be there, wouldn't we? Well, that's not right. Yes, we would be. Because I worked all day long for you. And she just worked here. Phil just worked a couple hours, and you're paying him $100? It's not fair, right? And the accountant says, it's my money. Can I not use it as I choose? And of course, the answer to that is, well, yes. Don't ever ask me to work for you again for a whole day, because it's not going to work out. That's the gist of the story that Jesus tells of the workers in the vineyard. Right? And he ends it with that line again, and the last will be first and the first will be last. That's the flow of the story. There are a couple stories particularly that Jesus tells that we have a hard time dealing with. The first one's in Luke. You know, it's the story about two brothers, and the one had it with everything, and he wants to just tear off and do things on his own, and so he goes to his dad. Remember that story? Goes to his dad and says, give me my share of the inheritance. And he takes off and he blows it all, right? And then he comes back, and the dad welcomes him back, and who grumbles about this? The other brother, because he's been there working away, being faithful. It's not fair. You're throwing a party for my younger brother who's wasted all his fortune, and you're throwing a party, and I get nothing? It's not fair. Remember that story? It troubles us. This is one of those stories as well that Jesus tells that just doesn't sit right with us. Forgot to put my screen up there. That story from Matthew of the workers in the vineyard. Because business-minded people, and there's many of you sitting in this room going, oh, that's not going to work. You know, if you're going to pay everybody the same every day, guess what? You're going to get no production out of anybody, because you're just going to show up the last hour and get your paycheck. You'll get nothing done, right? What's wrong with this? There's two verses that I want to go back into the Bible to pull up to remind us of this. First one is from Isaiah, where God says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God says, I don't play by your rules. I've got my own, and mine are better. And this other one is from Samuel. Remember when Samuel was to go to anoint the new king, and he goes to Bethlehem and and he sees this string of young men, and asks, "Is there another boy?" You know, and that's when they go get David out of the field. But when he sees the first of the sons, and there's this rugged, handsome guy, and he says, that's it, that's got to be the king. And God tells him this: the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. God sees things differently than we do. Jesus is challenging us with his story, and if we didn't hear the first very few words of this story, we'll get lost in it. Because in the very opening words he says, "And the kingdom of heaven is like," and then he starts telling the story. So he's referring to, he goes, this is what God is like. And he tells that story. And we jump right on board with this story because we would be just like those guys that have been there working from the very beginning. And we would be so envious of the guys that just showed up at the end and got paid the same amount of money. And it just amazes me that Jesus, in a lot of these stories where they want to get at us, uses money to trigger that thing within us. Because we want to boil it down to dollars and cents. So Jesus tells this story. The people about it got to be sitting there listening to this story, just shaking their heads. Oh, this can't be right. Well, I think what Jesus is inviting us into is to understand how to live our lives, to be in gratitude for what's been given to us, rather than envious of what others have. For instance, 2 weeks ago, my brother-in-law farms quite a lot. If you're driving through Raymond and the first elevator that you see coming in from the north in Raymond is not a public elevator, it's his. And he had done some major remodeling over the winter to it, and they put up this big overhead storage tank to drive under to fill semis. And last Sunday afternoon, it collapsed while a man was there filling a semi. Literally crushed the trailer. The only thing left of it is the back end and the rear axles. I saw the fellow that was injured in this just Friday. He has 7 broken ribs. Beat up, bruised, cuts, but he's survived it. Just because he heard something creak above him and he took off moving and got away. Now, I tell you this story because this is, lucky that the fellow lived, right? Major damage to the system. And somebody starts a rumor that it required the state police to investigate this accident. Because they said, well, he did it to get the insurance money out of it. And anybody would know that. Why would you do that? You lost money out of this thing, plus you lost production because this is his main dumping facility for this corn that's coming in at 25 to 30% moisture. He's shut down because of this, and yet out of envy for somebody that is willing to take risk and build something like this, they start this rumor that has to be followed up by the authorities. That's that power of envy in our lives. And you know what? And if you let it fester long enough within you, it starts to lead into more things. It will, for instance, terribly unfortunate circumstances in Mattoon this week, but, just a little envy, a little jealousy, and that starts to build, and pretty soon we've got a young man with a gun in a school. That's how this can snowball and work on our lives. And I think Jesus is inviting us to say, you don't have to be that way. Rather than allowing envy to so influence your lives, when you look at what somebody else has, look at what you do have, what you've been blessed with, and respond in gratitude to God for blessing you so. What are we talking about here? We're talking about grace of God. Right? That God graciously loves us, forgives us, claims us as his own. We don't deserve that. And yet God does. It's because of grace that God opens his arms to liars and adulterers and cheats and sinners, and folks like you and folks like me. It says, I love you. You see, I was putting this in context in the Bible earlier, and the next story after this, Jesus says, he's walking along with them and says, we're going to Jerusalem. They're going to arrest me. I'm going to be executed. He's pointing to the very reason of this source of this grace. It will be through his death. Oh, and by the way, the disciples don't get it because the very next story is Zebedee's wife shows up to plead with Jesus to give James and John left and right-hand seats when he comes to power. And all the other disciples get jealous about it. Envy, jealousy, greed, power. And yet Jesus says, it doesn't have to be that way. Be thankful for what you've been given. I think about the guys that got the call at 5 o'clock to come out and work for another hour, picking grapes. And he gets this denarius, a day's wage paid in his coin. And he's just a day laborer. If he doesn't get somebody to give him a job that day, then there's no money to take home. That day he goes home with his denarius. Walks in, he sets it on the kitchen table, and his wife said, you found work? It's great because we were about out of food. Oh, we'll be able to survive a few more days now. You're tired. You've been working all day long. Sit down and rest. I'll get you something